before toilets, before showers, before deodorant, before washing machines. People in the Middle Ages still had to wake up every morning and deal with the same human problem. Their bodies smelled, their clothes got dirty, their streets filled with mud, animals, waste, and smoke. And somewhere in the corner of the room, there was usually a chamber pot waiting to be emptied. But here is the surprising part. Medieval people were not as careless about cleanliness as we often imagine. Tonight, we're going to step quietly into a candlelit village and follow the strange, uncomfortable, and surprisingly practical ways ordinary people try to stay clean in a world with no modern plumbing. Welcome to Quiet History. Settle in, get comfortable, and let's drift back into the hidden daily life of medieval cleanliness.
Before the first grey light touches the fields, before the cockerel calls from somewhere across the frozen mud of the yard, there is a moment, brief, absolute, when the medieval world holds its breath. Inside the cottage, the darkness is not empty, it is full. The structure itself is modest to a degree that modern eyes would struggle to process as habitation. Wattle and daub, a lattice of woven hazel rods packed with a mixture of clay, straw and animal dung, forms walls that are roughly a foot thick, uneven in surface, and perpetually damp at the base where the earth presses against them from outside. The floor is earthen, beaten hard by years of foot traffic, worn smooth near the hearth and rougher toward the walls where the animals stand. There is no foundation in any modern sense. The cottage sits directly on the ground, and the ground, in late autumn, England, of around 1300, is cold in a way that rises through the soles of feet and settles into the bones of anyone who stands still too long. The ceiling is low enough that a tall person would instinctively duck near the central beam, a rough-hewn timber of oak darkened by years of smoke to the color of old iron. The thatch above it is thick, layered and alive in the way that organic things are alive. It harbors sparrows in its outer layers, insects deeper in, and the slow, patient work of moisture and decay throughout. It is not a clean ceiling. It is not a clean ceiling. It is not meant to be. It is meant to keep out the rain. And in this, most of the time, it succeeds. At the center of the room, the hearth. Not a fireplace. It's already setting in. There is no chimney, no flue, no architectural provision for the removal of smoke. The fire burns in a shallow pit of clay and stones set directly into the earthen floor, and the smoke from it rises in slow, unhurried columns toward the thatch above, finding its way out through the gaps in the roof material with the patience of something that has nowhere else to be. By morning, the embers are still glowing, a faint, deep orange pulse beneath a crust of grey ash, holding the last warmth of the previous night's fire. Like a secret, the smoke that lingers in the room is not an accident or a failure of design. It is simply the condition of the space. Every surface, the walls, the rafters, the rough wool of the blankets, the hair and skin of the people sleeping within, carries the smell of it. Wood smoke is the base note of this world, the olfactory ground on which everything else is layered. And there is much else layered on top of it. Near the far wall, in the section of the cottage that is not quite separated from the human living space, but is understood to belong to the animals, 2 goats stand in the pre-dawn dark. 2 goats stand in the pre-dawn dark, their breath rising in small clouds of vapor. A pig, penned loosely with a low hurdle of woven wood, shifts its weight and exhales. The warmth these animals generate is not incidental. It is calculated, deliberate, and essential. In the deep cold of an English winter, the body heat of livestock sharing an enclosed space with a family represents a meaningful contribution to survival. The smell they contribute, dung, wet, animal hide, the particular sharp sweetness of goat, mingles with the wood smoke and the damp earth and the tallow of the single rush light that burned the previous evening and has since guttered out. On the straw pallets near the hearth, the family sleeps. Thomas and Eleanor, with their children pressed close between them and against them, are arranged in the practical geometry of people who have learned to share warmth efficiently. The pallets themselves are raised slightly from the floor, on low wooden frames, not for comfort in any luxurious sense, but because the cold of the earthen floor is a genuine threat, and even a few inches of elevation makes a difference that the body registers and remembers. The straw within the pallets is old enough to have compressed and matted, no longer the fresh, clean-smelling material it was when last replaced. It harbors, as all such straw does, the small, persistent life of fleas and lice. Not because the family is negligent, but because this is the condition of straw bedding in a world without pesticides, without the ability to launder a mattress, without any mechanism for the elimination of vermin, beyond the periodic and laborious replacement of the straw itself. The wool blankets pulled over the sleeping family are rough to the touch, undyed, coarse spun, smelling of lanolin and smoke and the accumulated warmth of many nights. They are heavy in the way that hand-woven wool is heavy, substantial, and they do their work well. Eleanor made them, or helped make them, or inherited them from someone who did. They are among the household's most significant possessions, and they are treated accordingly. Shaken out, aired when the weather permits, mended at the edges where the weave has begun to fray. In the corner nearest the door, almost invisible in the pre-dawn dark, sits the chamber pot. It is a plain clay vessel, wide-mouthed, unglazed, with a slight crack near the base that has been sealed with tallow. Its presence in the room is unremarkable. Its presence in the room is unremarkable as the bucket near the door, or the iron pot hanging from its hook above the hearth, or the wooden spoon resting on the hearthstone. It is a tool. It serves a function. In a world without plumbing, without the infrastructure of sanitation that modern life renders invisible, the chamber pot is the most universal and democratic of technologies, present in peasant cottage and castle chamber alike, differing only in the material from which it is made. Through the night, when the cold outside the blankets makes the thought of stepping out into the yard an unappealing one, the chamber pot receives what it is meant to receive. In the morning it will be emptied. This is the rhythm of the thing, and it is as natural and unremarkable as the rhythm of the fire. The wooden bucket near the door holds water drawn the previous evening from the village well. It is not full, it is never quite full, because full buckets are heavy to carry and the well is not close. What remains is enough for the morning's first necessities. A cupped handful to rinse the face, water for the iron pot, water for the animals. The bucket itself is old, its staves darkened and slightly swollen from years of contact with water, its iron hoop beginning to rust at the join. It smells faintly of the well, cold stone and deep earth and the mineral sharpness of water that has travelled up through chalk and clay. This is the world that Thomas will enter when he rises. He will rise before the others, not because he has been told to, not because there is a schedule in any formal sense, but because the animals need tending, and the fire needs building, and the water bucket needs refilling, and none of these things will do themselves. He will swing his legs off the pallet, and his feet will meet the cold earthen floor, and the cold will travel up through him in the way it always does, and he will not remark on it, because there is nothing to remark on. It is simply the morning. He will pull on his wool tunic, still carrying the warmth of sleep, and his rough-spun hose, and his leather boots, perpetually damp, perpetually mud-caked, resoled so many times that the original leather of the soul exists only in memory. He will take the wooden yoke from its hook near the door and lift the empty bucket and step out into the pre-dawn dark of the village, and the cold will hit him with the full force of a late autumn morning in England, and he will lower his head against it and walk. The question that hangs over this world, over this cottage, this family, this morning, is not a simple one. It is not the question that is sometimes asked with a kind of reflexive disgust, the question that assumes medieval people were simply dirty, simply ignorant, simply indifferent to the condition of their bodies and their spaces. That question misunderstands the evidence. It misunderstands the effort. It misunderstands what cleanliness means when it must be earned physically every single day against the resistance of cold water and heavy buckets and the absence of every convenience that modern life has made invisible. The real question is more interesting and more human. In a world without running water, without soap as a daily commodity, without toilet paper, without showers, without the infrastructure of sanitation that the modern world takes entirely for granted, how did ordinary people understand cleanliness? What did they do, practically and daily, to manage the condition of their bodies, their clothing, their spaces? What did they know, and what did they believe, and what did the texture of their daily lives actually feel and smell and look like? The answers are not what the modern imagination tends to assume. They are more nuanced, more practical, and in many ways more impressive. because they represent the accumulated wisdom of communities that had been solving these problems, generation after generation, with the materials and knowledge available to them. Medieval people were not passive in the face of dirt and disease. They were active, deliberate, and often surprisingly sophisticated in their management of the physical world. But that understanding begins here. In this room, in this pre-dawn dark, with the embers glowing in the hearth pit and the smoke curling upward through the thatch and the animals breathing their warm breath in the corner and the chamber pot sitting in its unremarkable corner and the bucket waiting by the door. It begins with the cold floor under bare feet and the weight of the yoke across tired shoulders and the long walk to the well in the dark. It begins, as most things in this world begin, with water, with the effort of getting it, and the care of using it, and the knowledge, practical, physical, accumulated across a lifetime of necessity, of what it can and cannot do. Thomas knows this knowledge in his hands and his back and his shoulders. Eleanor knows it in the way she portions the water in the bucket, the way she decides what gets washed first and what waits. Their children are learning it, as children in this world learn everything by watching, by doing, by the slow accumulation of physical understanding, that no book could provide even if books were available to them. The embers pulse once in the dark, a slow orange breath. The smoke rises, the animals shift outside. The first pale suggestion of grey begins to separate the horizon from the sky, and the medieval morning, cold, practical, and entirely real, begins its slow, unhurried arrival. The well stands at the center of everything, not at the center of the village in any planned or architectural sense. Medieval villages were not designed with the geometric precision of later urban thinking. But at the center of daily life, the center of necessity, the center of the invisible web of labor that held the community together from one morning to the next. It is a stone-rimmed circle, roughly built, its mortar darkened with age and moisture, its inner walls slick with the perpetual condensation of deep, cold water rising toward the surface. Around it, the ground has been worn to a smooth, compacted depression by the feet of generations. Every morning, every evening, every time, a bucket ran dry and needed filling again. Thomas reaches the well in the grey half-light before full dawn, his breath clouding in the cold air, the wooden yoke across his shoulders, carrying the empty bucket with a lightness that will not last. He is not alone. He is rarely alone. At the well, at this hour, the women of the village, Eleanor among them, on other mornings, neighbors whose names and faces are as familiar as the landscape itself, gather here in the first light with the same purpose and the same economy of movement. There is conversation sometimes, the exchange of information the small currency of community life. But there is also silence, the companionable silence of people engaged in shared, necessary work, who have stood in this same spot, doing this same thing, so many times that the action has become its own kind of language. The mechanics of drawing water from a medieval village well are straightforward, and they are also, in the accumulated repetition of a lifetime, genuinely demanding. A rope, hemp, rough, darkened with use, fraying at the point where it meets the bucket's iron ring, winds around a wooden windlass mounted across the well's opening. The bucket descends into the dark, striking the water with a hollow sound that echoes up the stone shaft, and then the winding begins. A full wooden bucket of water weighs, depending on its size, somewhere between 8 and 12 pounds. It does not feel like a great weight in the hand. For the first moment, it feels like a great weight by the time it has been carried 200 yards across uneven, muddy ground. It feels like a greater weight still on the return trip, when the yoke sits across shoulders that have already been carrying it for an hour, and the cold has settled into the hands around the bucket's handle, and the mud of the village street pulls at every step. This is the physical reality of water in the medieval village. It does not arrive. It must be fetched. Every cup of water used for drinking, for cooking, for washing a face or rinsing a cloth, or cleaning a wound. Every drop of it represents a specific measurable expenditure of human energy. This is not a metaphor or an abstraction. It is a physical fact that shapes every decision about how water is used, how much is used, and what it is used for. Water is not wasted in this world. It cannot be. The effort required to obtain it makes waste a kind of luxury that ordinary people simply cannot afford. And yet, and this is the point that the historical record makes with surprising clarity, water was used. Regularly, deliberately, and with a practical understanding of its importance that modern assumptions about medieval hygiene tend to obscure. Despite the general lack of running water and other modern amenities, there were common expectations of personal hygiene in the medieval world. Washing the hands before and after eating was regarded as good etiquette in a period when cutlery was still a rarity for most people. When food was taken directly from shared dishes with the fingers, when the cleanliness of hands was not merely a matter of personal preference, but of communal necessity. The basin of water set out before meal was not an affectation. It was a practical response to the reality of how food was eaten, and it was expected. The village well itself was not the only source of water, and understanding the full geography of water in a medieval settlement means looking beyond the stone circle at its center. Cisterns collected rainwater or natural ground, seepage, a technology documented at various sites across medieval England where the collection and storage of water was a matter of genuine engineering concern. In more substantial establishments, the sophistication of water management could be considerable. At Rochester Castle in England, a system of buckets and ropes running inside the walls allowed water to be drawn from the well at every level of the keep, a piece of practical engineering that brought water directly to the spaces where it was needed, rather than requiring it to be carried upstairs by hand. At Chester Castle, a system of lead, wooden, or ceramic pipes carried water from a cistern to lower parts of the castle, including the kitchens, an arrangement that would not have seemed out of place in a Roman building several centuries earlier, and that speaks to the genuine ingenuity applied to the problem of water distribution when resources permitted. But for the village, for Thomas and Eleanor and their neighbors, these were distant realities. The well was what they had, and the well was enough to sustain life, enough to permit the daily rituals of washing that the community expected of itself, enough to make possible the cooking and cleaning and animal tending that constituted the work of every day. Enough, but only just and only with effort. Beyond the well, the village street itself tells a story about water and cleanliness that is worth examining without flinching. The unpaved lanes of a medieval English village were not the picturesque, muddy, but manageable paths of romantic imagination. They were deeply rutted by cartwheels and animal hooves, perpetually damp in all at the driest summer months, and layered with a complex stratigraphy of organic material that accumulated faster than it could be managed. Animal waste from the livestock that moved freely through the settlement, cattle, pigs, chickens, geese, mixed with the ash from hearth fires, the food scraps thrown from doorways, and the contents of chamber pots emptied each morning into the street or the shallow ditch running along its edge. These open drainage channels, shallow ditches cut along the sides of unpaved village streets, were the primary sanitation infrastructure of the medieval settlement. They were not sophisticated, and they were not always effective, particularly in wet weather when they filled and overflowed, and the distinction between the ditch and the street became largely theoretical. But they represented a genuine attempt to direct waste away from living spaces to channel the inevitable overflow of a community's daily life toward the edges of the inhabited area, and, ideally, toward the fields where it could serve as fertilizer. The logic was practical, if imperfect. The smell, particularly in warm weather, was simply part of the texture of village life, present, unremarkable, and managed as best it could be with the part. Tools available. It is the river, however, that represents the true center of more thorough washing in the medieval village. Moving water, cold, clear, perpetually renewed, was the primary site for the kind of cleaning that went beyond the daily face washing at the basin or the quick rinse of hands before a meal. The river or stream at the edge of the settlement was where laundry was done, where bodies were washed in the warmer months, where animals were watered and rinsed, where the accumulated dirt of a week's work could be addressed with something approaching thoroughness. The riverbank in the early morning is a particular kind of place. In late autumn, the grass along the edge is stiff with frost, the water running dark and quick between banks of mud and stone. The women who come here to wash, and it is primarily women, though not exclusively, carry their bundles of soiled linen wrapped in cloth, their wooden paddles, their small portions of lye or rough soap, The work begins with the wetting of the cloth, plunging it into the cold current and feeling the cold travel instantly up through the hands and wrists and forearms in a way that is not quite pain, but is close enough to it. The cloth is beaten against flat stones at the water's edge. A wooden paddle used to drive the water through the weave, to loosen the dirt that has settled into the fibers over days of wear. The sound carries across the water, a rhythmic, hollow percussion that is one of the characteristic sounds of the medieval morning. Wet linen spread on grass to bleach in whatever pale winter sun the season offers. This is another image from the riverbank that the historical record preserves. The bleaching of cloth through exposure to sunlight and air was a genuine and understood process, practiced across medieval Europe as a means of whitening linen that had yellowed or grayed with use. It required time and space, and the willingness to leave valuable cloth unattended in a field, which speaks to a degree of community trust and shared understanding of common practice. The cloth spread on the frost-stiffened grass in the thin winter light steams faintly as it dries. A quiet, patient process that takes hours and produces results that are modest by modern standards, but genuinely meaningful in the context of a world where clean linen was a real and valued achievement. The geography of cleanliness in the medieval village, then, is not a geography of absence. It is not a landscape defined by the lack of water or the indifference to its uses. It is a landscape defined by the effort required to obtain water and by the practical intelligence applied to its use once obtained. Every act of washing, the face rinsed at the basin, the hands cleaned before the meal, the linen beaten against the riverbank stone, represents a decision made in full awareness of the cost of the water used and the labor required to obtain it. These decisions were not made carelessly. They were made with the precision of people for whom every resource had a weight and a value that could be felt in the body. The wooden troughs near the well, worn smooth at their edges by the hands of animals and the people who tended them, held water that served multiple purposes in sequence. First for drinking, then for washing, then for the animals, the hierarchy of use, determined by the same practical logic that governed everything in this world. Nothing was wasted, nothing could be. The effort embedded in every bucket of water made waste not merely impractical, but something close to unthinkable. Thomas, returning from the well with the full bucket swinging from the yoke, feels the weight of it across his shoulders with the familiarity of something he has felt every morning of his adult life. He does not think about the water in any philosophical sense. He thinks about how much of it Eleanor will need for the morning's cooking, and how much he should set aside for the animals, and whether the bucket will last until evening, or whether he will need to make the journey again before dark. These are the calculations of a man who understands water not as a resource in the abstract, but as a physical reality with specific weight and specific limits and specific demands on his time and strength. The village well, as the morning fully arrives and the grey light strengthens over the frost-stiffened fields, becomes briefly the social center of the settlement. Neighbors exchange words over the stone rim. Information moves through the community with the water. News of illness, of weather, of the condition of the roads, of what the Lord's men were seen doing at the edge of the common field. The well is not merely a source of water, it is a gathering point, a place where the individual labor of each household briefly intersects with the collective life of the village, where the private necessity of the fur, morning becomes, for a few minutes, a shared and communal act. And then the moment passes. The buckets are full, the yokes are lifted, the footpaths diverge toward their separate cottages. The well stands empty in the strengthening light, its rope hanging still, its water dark and cold and patient in the depths below. The village moves into its day, carrying its water carefully, using it with the deliberate economy of people who understand in their bones and their shoulders and their hands exactly what it costs to bring it here. The geography of cleanliness in this world is, finally, a geography of labor, of the distance between the well and the door, of the weight of a full bucket against a tired shoulder, of the cold of the river against hands that are already cold. It is a geography measured, not in miles, but in effort, in the accumulated physical cost of keeping a body, a household, and a community as clean as the available world permits. And within those limits, the medieval village managed. It managed with intelligence, with habit, with the practical wisdom of generations, and with the quiet, unspectacular determination of people for whom cleanliness was not a luxury or an aesthetic preference, but a matter of survival, earned daily at the well. Steam rises from the surface of the water before the first customer of the morning has even arrived. The iron cauldrons have been heating since, before dawn, tended by the bathhouse keeper's apprentice, a boy whose primary qualification for the work is his willingness to rise in darkness and feed wood into a fire that never quite seems satisfied. By the time the pale winter light begins to filter through the gaps in the timber walls, the water in the wooden tubs is warm enough to be worth paying for, and in a medieval market town of any size, people will pay for it. The bathhouse known in medieval England as a stew, in France as an étuve, in the Low Countries by various local names, was not a marginal or disreputable institution in the period between roughly 1200 and 1400. It was a genuine and popular feature of urban life, commercially successful, socially normal, and busy enough in most towns to support multiple competing establishments. The historical record documents bathhouses operating in London, Paris, Bruges, and dozens of smaller towns across medieval Europe, serving customers from across the social spectrum, artisans, merchants, servants, travelers, and occasionally members of the clergy who had decided that the theological complications of bodily comfort were outweighed by the practical appeal of hot water. The building itself is modest, low-ceilinged, timber-framed, with walls of wattle and daub or close-set planking. It sits on the edge of the market area, where the smell of the cauldrons and the steam from the tubs will not trouble the food stalls too directly. Inside, the air is warm in a way that is immediately, physically striking to anyone who has spent a morning in the cold outside. A damp, enveloping warmth that carries the smell of wood smoke and wet wood, and the faint, sharp edge of lye soap. The floor is packed earth, worn smooth near the entrance and rougher toward the back, where the cauldrons stand over their fires. Wooden tubs, large enough to sit in, deep enough to submerge to the chest, are arranged along the walls, each one filled from the cauldrons by ladle and bucket, the water adjusted to a temperature that is hot enough to be genuinely useful without being scalding. The tubs themselves are worth examining. They are cooperage work, staves of oak or elm bound with iron hoops, the same craft that produced barrels and buckets and every other container in a world without plastic or glass. They are heavy, solid, and slightly rough to the touch at the inner surface, where the wood has absorbed years of hot water and the residue of soap and skin. They are large enough for one person to sit comfortably, or two people to sit less comfortably, or two people to sit less comfortably, which was a common enough arrangement in an era when the social conventions around shared bathing were considerably more relaxed than modern sensibilities might expect. Bathing in medieval Europe was not, for most of this period, considered an inherently private act. It was a practical one, and practicality often meant sharing the hot water rather than wasting it. Far from being avoided, bathing was considered desirable and socially normal across much of medieval Europe. Medical authorities of the period recommended it. The physicians and scholars who worked within the tradition of Galenic medicine understood bathing as beneficial to health, as a means of opening the pores, removing impurities from the skin, and restoring the balance of the body's humors. This was not folk wisdom operating in ignorance of learned opinion. The learned opinion and the ad opinion and the opinion. Popular practice were, for once, in agreement. Washing the body was good, and hot water was better than cold. The soak available in the bathhouse was tallow soap, rendered animal fat, combined with wood ash lye, boiled together and allowed to set into a soft grey-brown substance, with a sharp grey-brown substance, with a sharp, slightly rancid smell that bore no resemblance to the perfumed baths of modern manufacture. It was effective in the sense that the alkaline lye it contained was genuinely capable of cutting through the oils and dirt accumulated on skin and hair. It was also relatively expensive for ordinary people, which meant that its use in the bathhouse was a genuine luxury, something paid for, along with the hot water and the warmth of the room. For the poor, or those living in the countryside, the Newcastle Castle historical record notes that a simple wipe down at a horse trough with a wet rag or a dunking in a nearby source of water was the more common reality. The bathhouse, with its tallow soap and heated tubs, represented a step up from this baseline, accessible to urban workers and tradespeople who could afford the modest fee, but not a universal experience. Those who could afford more than tallow soap might wash with sweet-smelling oils, preparations scented with herbs or imported aromatics that served both to clean the skin and to leave it smelling of something other than the accumulated odors of daily life. At the upper end of the social scale, the lords and ladies documented in the historical record were known to wash, or at minimum to perform what the sources describe as topping and tailing, a thorough washing of the face, hands and feet, at least twice a day. This was not the behavior of people indifferent to cleanliness. It was the behavior of people with the resources to act on a genuine preference for it. Beyond the commercial bathhouse, the range of washing environments across medieval society was wide, and each had its own particular character and physical reality. In the monastery, the lavatorium occupied a specific and architecturally deliberate position. Typically a long stone trough set in the cloister walk, positioned between the dormitory and the refectory, so that monks could wash their hands before entering the dining hall. The ritual of hand washing before meals was not merely hygienic in the monastic context, it was liturgical, a gesture of purification that carried spiritual weight as well as practical purpose, connecting the act of cleaning the body to the preparation of the soul for the shared meal that followed. The water in the lavatorium was cold, fed from a cistern or a piped supply where the monastery's resources permitted, and the monks washed in sequence, efficiently, without lingering, the rule of Saint Benedict governing the pace and manner of even this most basic of daily acts. The stone trough of the lavatorium was worn smooth at its edges by the hands of generations of monks, a physical record of accumulated use, the same kind of wear that marks the well rim in the village and the threshold stone of the cottage door. These worn surfaces are among the most eloquent pieces of evidence the medieval world has left behind, proof, written in stone and wood, of the daily, repeated, habitual acts of cleaning that constituted medieval hygiene. They are not the evidence of a world that did not wash. They are the evidence of a world that washed regularly, enough to wear stone smooth. In the castle, the arrangements for washing varied considerably, depending on the resources and ambitions of the lord. At Rochester Castle in England, the remarkable system of buckets and ropes running inside the walls allowed water to be drawn from the well at every level of the keep, a piece of practical engineering that brought water directly to the chambers where it was needed, rather than requiring servants to carry it up. Multiple flights of stairs. At Chester Castle, lead, wooden, or ceramic pipes carried water from a cistern to the kitchens and other lower parts of the building. A system that would have been recognizable to a Roman engineer, and that system the genuine sophistication applied to water management, and the resources to support it were available. In the servants' quarters of such a castle, a wooden basin on a stand held water for the morning wash. Cold, practical, sufficient for the face and hands, that were the minimum expected standard of daily cleanliness. Soap, in all these environments, was present, but never abundant. Its production required wood ash lye, made by dissolving ash in water and straining the resulting liquid through cloth, combined with rendered animal fat, typically tallow from cattle or sheep. The mixture was boiled together until it reached the right consistency, then cooled and cut or stored in soft form. The process was not complicated, but it required fuel, fat, and time, all of which were in limited supply in ordinary households. Soap was made in batches, used sparingly, and supplemented by other cleaning agents where possible. Sand and fine grit served as abrasives for scrubbing skin and surfaces. Urine collected and aged provided an alkaline solution that could substitute for lye in a pinch, a practice documented across multiple medieval sources and grounded in the genuine chemistry of ammonia as a cleaning agent. Hanging from the low rafters of the bathhouse and from the rafters of better appointed cottages and castle chambers alike were bundles of dried herbs, lavender, rosemary, mint, and other aromatic plants that served multiple purposes simultaneously. They scented the air of the room, contributing their sharp, clean fragrance to the mixture of wood smoke and damp wood and human bodies. They were added to washing water to leave a faint scent on skin and cloth. They were tucked into clothing and bedding as a partial defense against the insects that were an inescapable feature of medieval domestic life. The smell of lavender in a medieval interior was not decorative in the modern sense. It was functional, a tool in the ongoing management of the sensory and biological environment of the household. Hair in the medieval world received attention that the historical and archaeological record documents with some specificity. Bone combs, found in considerable numbers at medieval archaeological sites across Europe, were used daily to comb and order the hair, removing tangles, debris, and the lice that were a persistent feature of life in close quarters. Wooden pins and simple metal clasps held hair in place under the linen coifs and head coverings that most medieval women wore as a matter of course, and that served the practical purpose of keeping hair contained and relatively clean between washings. Hair was oiled with animal fat or plant-based oils to keep it manageable and to give it a degree of protection against the drying effects of smoke and cold air. It was washed occasionally when water and time permitted, using lye or herbal preparations, and combed through while still damp to prevent matting. The bone comb found in the archaeological record is a small object, easily overlooked. It fits in the palm of the hand, its teeth worn and occasionally broken, its surface darkened with age and use. It was carried on the person, used daily, and valued enough to be repaired when it broke and replaced when it could no longer be repaired. It is, in its modest way, as eloquent as the worn stone of the lavatorium, evidence of a daily practice, a habitual attention to the condition of the body. that contradicts the assumption of universal medieval indifference to personal cleanliness. Back in the bathhouse, the morning is advancing. The water in the tubs has cooled slightly from its initial heat, and the apprentice moves between the cauldrons and the tubs, with a ladle topping up the warmth. The steam has thinned a little as the room temperature has risen to meet it. The smell of the place, wood smoke, wet oak, lye soap, the faint animal note of tallow, is simply the smell of cleanliness in this world, as specific and recognizable as the smell of chlorine in a modern swimming pool, and no less associated with the act of washing the body. And then there is the basin, the simplest, most universal, most democratic instrument of medieval hygiene, a wooden bowl, worn smooth by years of daily use, holding cold water in a dim room. It might sit on a shelf in a cottage, on a stand in a castle chamber, on the stone ledge of a monastic lavatorium. Its water might be cold or warm, scented with herbs, or plain, supplemented by soap or used alone. But the act it enables, the cupping of water in the hands, the washing of the face, the rinsing of the fingers before a meal, is the same act across all these environments, performed by the same human hands, for the same practical and social reasons. The wooden basin does not survive well in the archaeological record. Wood rods and the ordinary objects of daily life are rarely preserved with the care given to weapons or jewelry or illuminated manuscripts, but its presence is documented in inventories. In illustrations, in the incidental details of household accounts that record the purchase of water, the acquisition of soap, the payment of the bathhouse keeper's fee. It was there in every household that could afford one, every morning, holding its small quantity of water, waiting for the hands that would use it, representing the daily, unglamorous, entirely real practice of medieval cleanliness. The bathhouse keeper, surveying his establishment in the strengthening morning light, sees what he sees every day, a room full of steam and warmth, wooden tubs filled with water that cost fuel and labor to heat, customers who have paid a modest fee for the specific valued experience of being genuinely clean. He does not think of this as remarkable. It is his livelihood, and it is busy, and the fact that it is busy, is itself the most direct possible evidence that medieval people wanted to wash, sought out the means to do so, and were willing to pay for the opportunity when they could afford it. The steam rises from the tubs in slow, unhurried columns, drifting toward the low rafters where the herb bundles hang drying, filling the room with the particular warmth of a space devoted to the simple, ancient, entirely human act of washing the body clean. The cold rises from below before anything else registers. It comes up through the shaft in a slow, steady current of air, carrying with it the particular chill of deep stone and darkness. A cold that is different from the cold of the open field or the frost-stiffened riverbank, more enclosed, more mineral, more absolute. the narrow stone alcove of the castle garderobe is perhaps 4 feet wide and 6 feet deep, cut into the thickness of the outer wall at the end of a short passage that angles away from the main corridor. The stone seat, a flat slab with an oval opening cut through it, positioned over the shaft that drops away into darkness below, has been worn smooth by generations of use, its surface polished by contact with human bodies in a way that no tool could replicate. It is cold to the touch. It is always cold to the touch. This is the medieval toilet, not a metaphor, not a euphemism, not a primitive approximation of something better to come. It is a piece of genuine architectural thinking, designed with a specific purpose and positioned with deliberate care within the structure of the building that contains it. The garderobe, the word itself, is French, meaning wardrobe or storage room, was a standard feature of castle construction across medieval Europe from roughly the 11th century onward. And its placement within the building was governed by practical considerations that any modern engineer would recognize as sound. The shaft below the stone seat drops through the thickness of the castle wall, sometimes running straight down the exterior face of the stonework to empty into the moat below, sometimes angling through internal channels to reach a cesspit dug at the base of the wall. Where the castle was positioned over or near a running stream, the shaft might empty directly into moving water, a natural flushing mechanism that required no human intervention, and that the builders of such structures clearly understood as preferable to the static accumulation of a pit. The waste shafts of some medieval toilets ran down the exterior of a fort into moats or rivers, while others were designed with internal castle channels that funneled waste into a courtyard or cesspit, a distinction that mattered considerably to the people responsible for maintaining the structure and managing its smells. The positioning of the garderobe within the castle was not arbitrary. It was typically located at the end of a passage, separated from the main living spaces by at least one turn in the corridor, an arrangement that served the practical purpose of preventing the direct flow of cold air and odor from the time shaft into the inhabited rooms. The shaft itself, dropping through several floors of masonry, created a natural updraft in certain weather conditions, a ventilation effect that carried odors upward and outward rather than allowing them to accumulate in the alcove. This was not accidental. The builders of medieval castles were working with the physics of air movement in enclosed spaces, and the positioning and dimensions of garderobe shafts reflect an empirical understanding of how to manage the consequences of their function. The name itself rewards attention. Garderobe, wardrobe, points to a practice that the historical record documents with some consistency. The storage of wool clothing in or near these spaces, where the ammonia fumes rising from the shaft below were believed to repel moths and other textile-destroying insects. Whether this practice was genuinely effective is a question that modern chemistry can address with some confidence. Ammonia does have insect-repelling properties, and the fumes rising from a garderobe shaft would have been present in sufficient concentration to have some effect on the insects that threatened stored wool. The medieval mind that made this connection between the smell of the toilet and the preservation of valuable cloth was not operating on superstition alone. It was making an empirical observation about cause and effect, and acting on it with the practical intelligence that characterized medieval approaches to the management of the physical world. The garderobe was not exclusively a castle feature. In larger urban buildings, the townhouses of wealthy merchants, the halls of guilds and civic institutions, similar arrangements existed, sometimes more modest in construction, but serving the same basic function. A projecting wooden structure, cantilevered from an upper floor, its floor opening over a pit or a street channel below, served the same purpose as the stone alcove of the castle garderobe, a dedicated space for the management of bodily waste, separated from the living areas of the building and designed to direct its contents away from the inhabited space. The monastery latrine represents perhaps the most sophisticated expression of medieval sanitation thinking available to the historical record. A long stone building typically positioned at the end of the dormitory range and connected to it by a covered passage, the monastic redoter, as it was known, was designed with a thoroughness that reflects the particular combination of communal living, institutional resources, and intellectual engagement with practical problems that characterized the great medieval monasteries. Multiple seats arranged in a row above a channel of running water, diverted from a nearby stream, or managed through a system of sluices and channels, provided a genuinely effective sanitation system that flushed waste continuously away from the building and into the watercourse below. The archaeological remains of monastic redoters at sites across England, Fountains Abbey, Rievaulx, Castle Acre Priory, among others, preserved the physical evidence of these arrangements with remarkable clarity. The stone seats, the channels beneath them. The stone seats, the channels beneath them. The sluice arrangements that controlled the flow of water. All of it speaks to a level of engineering investment in sanitation that was, within its context, genuinely impressive. The monks who used these facilities were not living in conditions of primitive squalor. They were living in conditions of institutional hygiene that, by the standards of their time, represented a considerable achievement. Near the monastery latrine, in the walled enclosure of the physic garden, grew the herbs that served the community's medical and practical needs. Lavender, rosemary, mint, wormwood, tansy, and rue, plants valued for their medicinal properties, their aromatic qualities, and their role in managing the smells and vermin of daily institutional life. The proximity of the physic garden to the latrine building was not coincidental. The monks who planned these spaces understood, in practical terms, the relationship between the management of waste, the control of odor, and the maintenance of the health of the community. The herbs grown nearby served as air fresheners in the most literal sense. Their volatile oils released into the air of the surrounding space, contributing their sharp, clean fragrance to an environment that required all the olfactory assistance it could get. For the village, for the ordinary peasant household that lacked the resources of the castle or the monastery, the arrangements were simpler and considerably less sophisticated, but they were not absent. The cesspit, a deep hole dug behind or beneath a cottage, lined with timber or stone, where resources permitted, covered with a wooden seat or a simple plank, was the primary sanitation technology of the rural medieval world. It accumulated the waste of the household over weeks or months, and when it was full, it was emptied, a task that fell to a specific category of worker, whose existence the historical record documents with the matter-of-fact clarity of a world that had no reason to be squeamish about necessary labor. These workers were known, in the records of medieval English towns, as gong farmers, the word gong being an old English term for a privy or cesspit. They worked at night by the light of torches or lanterns, removing the accumulated waste from urban cesspits with shovels and buckets, loading it into carts, and transporting it to the fields outside the town where it was spread as fertilizer. The work was unpleasant by any standard, and the historical record acknowledges this implicitly in the regulations that governed it. Gong farmers were required to work after dark. Partly to spare the sensibilities of the town's inhabitants, and partly because the smell of their work was considered incompatible with the daytime commerce of the streets. They were paid for their labor, sometimes quite well by the standards of unskilled work, and they performed a function that was essential to the sanitation of the medieval city, removing from the urban environment the accumulated waste that, left in place, would have created conditions genuinely dangerous to public health. The waste they removed did not disappear. It was transported to the fields surrounding the town and incorporated into the agricultural cycle, a practical closing of the loop between human waste and food production that modern sanitation systems, for all their sophistication, have largely severed. Medieval farmers understood, empirically if not in the biochemical terms that would come later, that human and animal waste improved the fertility of the soil. The gong farmer's cart, moving through the dark streets of a medieval town in the small hours of the morning, was carrying something of genuine agricultural value, and the fields that received its contents were the better for it. The chamber pot returns here as the most universal sanitation technology of the medieval world, present in every household regardless of social standing, differing only in the material from which it was made. The peasant's chamber pot was plain clay, unglazed, functional. The merchant's might be glazed earthenware, better finished, perhaps fitted with a lid. The wealthy households might be pewter, or even silver in the most elevated contexts, the same basic object, the same basic function, rendered in materials that reflected the resources of its owner. Through the night, when the cold and the dark made the journey to the cesspit or the outdoor privy an unappealing prospect, the chamber pot served its purpose in the warmth of the sleeping room. In the morning, it was emptied into the cesspit, into the street channel, into the ditch at the edge of the property, and rinsed and returned to its place in the corner. The emptying of chamber pots into the street was a practice sufficiently common in medieval towns to attract the attention of municipal authorities. The ordinances passed by medieval town councils attempting to regulate where waste could be dumped represent some of the most direct evidence available of the sanitation challenges facing urban medieval communities and of the genuine attempts made to address them through collective regulation. London's medieval authorities issued repeated ordinances against the dumping of waste into the streets and waterways of the city, specifying where cesspits could be located, how they must be constructed, and how their contents must be disposed of. The fact that these ordinances were issued repeatedly suggests that compliance was imperfect, but the fact that they were issued at all speaks to a genuine civic concern with the management of waste and its consequences for public health. The open sewers running through the centers of medieval cities were not the result of indifference to sanitation. They were, in many cases, the result of deliberate engineering. Channels cut through the street surface to direct the flow of wastewater and runoff away from the inhabited areas and toward the rivers or fields beyond the city's edge. They were maintained, periodically cleaned, and regulated by municipal authorities, who understood, in practical terms, the relationship between standing water, accumulated waste, and the outbreak of disease. The understanding was not expressed in the language of germ theory. That would come centuries later, but it was real, grounded in the observed experience of communities that had learned through repeated and painful experience what happened when waste was allowed to accumulate unchecked. The smell of the medieval city, the layered, complex, overwhelming smell that would strike any modern visitor with the force of a physical blow, was not simply the smell of neglect or ignorance. It was the smell of a community managing, as best it could, the biological consequences of dense human habitation without the infrastructure of modern sanitation. The open drains, the cesspits, the gong farmers working in the dark, the ordinances about waste disposal, the positioning of the garderobe over the moat, all of these were responses to the same fundamental challenge, applied with the intelligence and the resources available, in a world that had not yet developed the engineering solutions that would eventually make the medieval city smell a matter of historical record rather than daily experience. Back in the narrow stone alcove of the castle garderobe, the cold air continues to rise from the shaft below. The stone seat, worn smooth by generations of use, holds the particular silence of a space that has served its purpose for centuries without ceremony or complaint. Above it, in the passage that leads back to the main corridor, a bundle of dried herbs hangs from an iron hook. Lavender, perhaps, or wormwood. Lavender, perhaps, or wormwood, its fragrance thin and persistent in the cold air, doing what it can against the smell that rises from below. It is not a glamorous space. It was never meant to be. It was meant to work, to provide a dedicated, separated, architecturally considered place. for the management of bodily waste, positioned to direct that waste away from the inhabited spaces of the building and toward the moat, or the pit, or the running water below. In this it succeeded. Not perfectly, not without smell, not without the ongoing labor of the gong farmers and the maintenance of the channels and the periodic emptying of the pits, but it succeeded in the way that medieval solutions to medieval problems generally succeeded, practically, empirically, within the limits of the available world. Within the limits of the available world, and with a degree of ingenuity that the historical record, examined without condescension, consistently reveals. The shaft drops away into darkness below the stone seat, carrying with it the evidence of daily human life, unremarkable, necessary, and managed with the same quiet, practical intelligence that characterized every other aspect of survival in the medieval world. The cold air rises, the herbs hang still in the passage above, and the garde-robe, in its narrow stone alcove at the end of its angled corridor, continues to do what it was built to do, quietly, efficiently, and entirely without apology. The shirt has not been washed in 3 weeks. This is not neglect, it is arithmetic. The arithmetic of water that must be carried, fire that must be fed, fire that must be fed, hours that must be found within days already stretched to their limit by every other demand of survival. The linen has absorbed, in those 3 weeks, the accumulated evidence of a human body at work: sweat, grease, the residue of smoke and cooking, the particular grey that settles into undyed cloth when it has been worn close to the skin through cold mornings and labor-heavy afternoons. It needs washing. Helena knows it needs washing. The question has never been whether, only when, and how, and with what. The primary textiles of medieval life were wool and linen, each with its own properties, its own relationship to the body, and its own particular demands when it came to the work of keeping it clean. Wool was the outer layer, the tunic, the hose, the cloak, worn against the elements and carrying the weight of daily outdoor labor. It was warm, durable, and forgiving of rough treatment in most respects, but it had a fundamental vulnerability that every person who worked with it understood intimately. Wool felts. Exposed to hot water and agitation, the microscopic scales on wool fibers lock together in a process that is irreversible and destroying the cloth and destroying its structure, shrinking the cloth and destroying its structure. Washing wool incorrectly was not merely ineffective, it was ruinous, and in a world where a wool tunic represented a significant investment of labor and material, ruining it through careless laundering was a genuine economic catastrophe. Linen was different in almost every relevant respect. Made from the processed fibers of the flax plant, linen was the fabric of the undergarment, the shirt worn directly against the skin, the coif covering the hair, the swaddling cloth wrapped around an infant, the sheets spread over the straw pallet. It was smoother than wool, cooler against the skin in summer, and possessed of a crucial property that made it the preferred fabric for the layer closest to the body. It could be boiled. Unlike wool, Linen survived immersion in hot water without felting or shrinking. It could be subjected to the full force of the medieval laundry process, soaking, boiling, beating, wringing, rinsing, and emerge from the ordeal clean, if not quite undamaged by the accumulated violence of repeated washing. This is why linen was washed more frequently than wool, not because medieval people had a sophisticated theory of hygiene that distinguished between the bacterial loads of different fabric layers, but because linen could survive the washing that wool could not, and because the layer closest to the body accumulated the most visible and olfactory evidence of wear. The laundry process began, as most processes in this world began, with preparation. The collection of soiled linen, shirts, coifs, the strips of cloth used as menstrual rags, the swaddling bands of infants, the table linen of households that possessed such things was the first step, and it was followed immediately by the preparation of lye. Lye was the central cleaning agent of the medieval laundry, and its production was a process that Eleanor and women like her across medieval Europe performed with the practiced efficiency of l'homme habit, wood ash saved from the hearth fire over days or weeks, stored in a wooden container near the door, was packed into a vessel with a hole or a cloth strainer at its base. Water was poured slowly over the ash, and the liquid that dripped through, dark, slightly viscous, carrying the dissolved alkaline salts from the ash, was the lye. It was caustic enough to irritate the skin on prolonged contact, strong enough to cut through the grease and protein deposits that accumulated in worn linen, and entirely free, requiring nothing beyond the ash that every hearth fire produced as a matter of course. The strength of the lye varied depending on the type of wood burned and the concentration of the resulting solution, and experienced laundresses developed a practical sense for its potency, testing it against the skin of the forearm, judging its color and weight, adjusting its concentration by dilution or by adding more ash. This was empirical chemistry, performed without instruments or formal knowledge, grounded entirely in accumulated physical experience. The woman who made lye in a medieval cottage was doing something that a modern chemist would recognize as the production of potassium hydroxide solution. She simply knew it as the thing that made cloth clean, and she knew how to make it work. The soiled linen was soaked in the lye solution first, submerged in a wooden tub or a clay vessel, weighted down with stones to keep it below the surface. Weighted down with stones to keep it below the surface, left to steep for hours while the alkaline solution worked its way into the fibers and began to break down the accumulated oils and organic material. The smell of this process was sharp and distinctive, the mineral, slightly acrid smell of wood, ash lye, cutting through the domestic odors of the cottage with a clarity that announced to anyone within range that laundry day had arrived. It was not an unpleasant smell in the context of its purpose. It was the smell of cleaning, as specific and recognizable in this world as the smell of detergent in a modern laundry room, and it carried the same association, something dirty becoming clean. After soaking came boiling. The iron cauldron, the largest and most valuable piece of equipment. In most medieval households, its acquisition representing a significant investment that was carefully maintained and passed down through generations, was filled with water and set over the open fire. The linen was transferred from the coal lye soak to the boiling water, sometimes with additional lye added to the cauldron, and the whole mass was brought to a rolling boil and kept there. The heat of boiling water served multiple purposes simultaneously. It drove the lye solution deeper into the fibers, enhancing its cleaning action. It killed the lice, eggs, and fleas that had taken up residence in the cloth during weeks of wear, a practical consequence of the boiling process that medieval laundresses understood empirically, even without the conceptual framework of germ theory, to explain why it worked. And it whitened the linen, the combination of heat and alkali working on the yellowed fibers, to restore something approaching their original color. The physical labor of managing a cauldron of boiling linen was considerable. The cloth, saturated with water, became enormously heavy. A single large sheet, or several shirts together, could weigh 10 or 15 pounds. When wet, and the work of stirring and turning the mass in the boiling water, using a long wooden paddle to keep the cloth moving and prevent it from scorching against the bottom of the cauldron, was hot, steam-filled, and exhausting. The fire beneath the cauldron had to be maintained at a consistent temperature for the duration of the boiling, not so fierce that the cloth scorched, not so low that the water ceased to boil, which required constant attention and the ongoing supply of fuel. Laundry day consumed wood at a rate that was itself a significant consideration in households where fuel was gathered by hand from the surrounding woodland, and every bundle of sticks represented an hour of someone's labor. After boiling came the carrying. The wet linen, steaming and heavy, had to be transferred from the cauldron to the river or stream for rinsing. For rinsing, the lye solution driven out of the fibers by repeated immersion in clean moving water, the cloth wrung and beaten, and rinsed until the water running from it ran clear. This journey from the cottage to the riverbank, carrying a bundle of wet cloth that grew heavier with every step on the uneven, muddy path, was a familiar ordeal, performed with the resigned efficiency of someone who has done it many times and knows exactly how long it will take and how much it will hurt. The cold of the river water against hands already reddened by the heat of the cauldron was a particular kind of shock, the body moving from one extreme to the other. In the space of a few minutes, the hands adjusting with the stoic practicality of hands that have no choice. At the riverbank, the beating began. But Kate explained. A wooden paddle, a flat-bladed tool, worn smooth at its handle and darkened at its striking face by years of use, was used to beat the wet cloth against flat stones at the water's edge, driving the water through the weave and loosening any remaining dirt that the lye and boiling had not fully addressed. The sound of this work, the rhythmic hollow percussion of wet cloth, against stone, carrying across the water in the cold morning air, was one of the characteristic sounds of the medieval riverbank, as familiar and unremarkable to those who heard it as the sound of a mill wheel or a blacksmith's hammer. It required strength, and it required time, and it left the arms aching in a way that was specific to this particular motion. The repeated overhead swing and downward strike, hour after hour, until the cloth was clean. The rinsed and beaten linen was then spread to dry on the grass of the riverbank, on the branches of bushes, on wooden frames or lines strung between posts where such arrangements existed. In summer, the pale English sun could bleach the spread cloth to a whiteness that the lye alone could not achieve. The photochemical action of ultraviolet light on the organic compounds in the linen fibers, producing a genuine whitening effect that medieval laundresses understood and relied upon, even without knowing its mechanism. In autumn and winter, the bleaching effect was minimal, the pale light insufficient for the purpose, and the cloth dried slowly in the cold air, stiffening slightly as it cooled, carrying the smell of clean water and the faint mineral sharpness of the lye that had passed through it. The laundry yard of a castle operated at a scale that made the cottage laundry process look modest by comparison. Stone troughs, permanent, built into the fabric of the service yard, held water for soaking and rinsing. Multiple iron cauldrons, larger than anything a peasant household could afford, stood over purpose-built fires. The laundresses employed in such establishments, women whose specific skill and labor was valued enough to be recorded in household accounts, worked in teams, dividing the tasks of soaking, boiling, beating, and drying among themselves with the organized efficiency of people performing a complex industrial process. The volume of linen produced by a large household was considerable. The bed linen of multiple chambers, the table linen of the great hall, the personal linen of the lord and lady, and their household servants, the napkins and towels and coifs and shirts that a functioning medieval establishment consumed in quantities that made laundry not a weekly domestic task, but an ongoing, not a weekly domestic task, near continuous operation. At the monastery, the riverbank outside the precinct walls served as the primary laundry space, where lay brothers spread linen on the grass in the pale morning light and performed the same beating and rinsing work that Eleanor performed at the village stream. The rule of Saint Benedict, which governed the daily life of Benedictine monasteries across medieval Europe, addressed the care of clothing and bedding with the same practical specificity it brought to every other aspect of communal life, specifying when linen should be washed, how it should be stored, and what the standards of cleanliness were expected to be. The monastery's institutional resources, its access to running water through managed channels, its permanent cauldrons and laundry facilities, its organized labor made it possible to maintain standards of textile cleanliness that were genuinely higher than those achievable in an ordinary household. The straw mattresses and bedding of the medieval world presented a different kind of challenge, one that the laundry process could address only partially. The straw within a pallet mattress could not be washed. It could only be replaced, and the frequency of its replacement was governed by the same practical arithmetic that governed everything else: the availability of fresh straw, the time required to empty and refill the pallet, the judgment of when the accumulated compression and contamination of the old straw had reached the point where replacement was necessary, rather than merely desirable. Fleas and lice colonized straw bedding with the efficiency of organisms that had evolved specifically for this ecological niche, and no amount of laundering the linen cover of the pallet could address the infestation within the straw itself. The periodic replacement of straw was the primary defense against this problem, supplemented by the use of dried herbs. Lavender, wormwood, tansy, tucked into the bedding as a partial deterrent against the insects that would otherwise have undisturbed possession of the sleeping space. The herbs served their purpose imperfectly, but genuinely. The volatile oils in lavender and wormwood had real insect-repelling properties that modern chemistry has confirmed, and that medieval experience had identified through the same empirical process that produced lye-making and riverbank bleaching. Observation, repetition, and the practical wisdom of accumulated generations. The smell of lavender in a medieval sleeping space was not merely pleasant. It was functional, a tool in the ongoing biological management of the household environment, as practical in its way as the lye in the laundry cauldron. The wool outer garments, the tunic, the hose, the cloak, were cleaned by methods that avoided the hot water and vigorous agitation that would have destroyed them. Brushing with stiff-bristled brushes removed surface dirt and debris, spot cleaning with cold water, and careful rubbing addressed specific stains. Airing, hanging the garment outside, in cold, moving air, refreshed the fabric and reduced odor without the risk of felting. These were not inadequate substitutes for proper washing. They were the correct methods for the material, applied with the knowledge of someone who understood what wool could and could not survive. The back of a peasant cottage, where a single pot of water served for washing both body and cloth, was the most constrained laundry environment in the medieval world. But it was not a space of complete helplessness. Eleanor worked within her constraints with the precision of someone who had learned, through necessity, to extract maximum effect from minimum resources. The water heated in the iron pot served first for the most urgent laundry need, then for washing the children, then for cleaning the cooking vessels, a hierarchy of use that wasted nothing and acknowledged the cost of every drop. The lye she made from the hearth ash was free, and she made it carefully, testing its strength, using it where it would do the most good. The river was a walk away, cold and reliable, and she made that walk when she needed to, carrying the wet cloth in a bundle against her hip, her arms already tired from the cauldron work. The result of all this labor, the soaking and boiling and beating and rinsing and spreading and drying, was clean linen, not the chemical bright white of modern laundered cloth, not the effortless cleanliness of a machine cycle, completed while attention is elsewhere. something harder won, more specific, more present to the senses. A freshly washed linen shirt drying near the hearth fire in the late afternoon steams faintly as the heat draws the last moisture from its fibers. The smell it releases is the smell of the process that cleaned it. Wood smoke from the fire that heated the cauldron. The faint mineral sharpness of the lye that passed through it. The cold water clarity of the river that rinsed it. It is not a perfumed smell. It is a clean smell, specific, earned, and entirely real. Thomas, returning from the fields in the early dark of a November afternoon, passes the shirt hanging near the fire and registers its presence with the quiet satisfaction of a man who notices small things. He does not remark on it. There is nothing to remark on it. There is nothing to remark on. Eleanor washed the linen today, as she washes it when it needs washing, as she has always done, as her mother did before her. The shirt will be dry by morning, and he will put it on, and it will be clean against his skin for the first time in 3 weeks. And that cleanliness, hard-won, temporary, weeks, and that cleanliness, hard-won, temporary, and entirely practical, is one of the small, real satisfactions of a life built from small, real things. The steam rises from the drying cloth in slow, thin wisps, drifting upward toward the smoke-darkened rafters, where the herb bundles hang. The fire pulses beneath the iron pot. Outside, the November dark has settled over the fields, and the village, and the well, and the medieval world has drawn itself inward toward its hearths, carrying with it the smell of lye and wood smoke and clean wet linen, the smell, in this world, of work completed and order briefly restored. In the walled enclosure of the monastery physic garden, in the walled enclosure of the monastery physic garden, even in the grey stillness of a November morning, the air carries something different from the world outside its stone boundary. It is not warmth. The cold presses equally here as everywhere else in late autumn England. It is smell, the particular layered, resinous smell of aromatic plants that have been cultivated in this enclosed space for generations, their volatile oils released by the cold air into something sharp and present and unmistakably alive. Lavender, its grey-green stems still holding the ghost of summer's purple. Rosemary, dark and needle-leaved, its fragrance the strongest of all in cold weather. Mint, cut back to the root but persisting, its smell rising from the disturbed earth around its base. Wormwood, silver-leafed and bitter. Tansy, its dried seed heads rattling faintly in the still air. Rue, its blue-green foliage the color of old copper, its smell sharp enough to make the eyes water at close range. These plants were not grown here for beauty, though beauty was incidental to their presence. They were grown here because they worked, because the accumulated empirical knowledge of monastic medicine, drawing on ancient classical sources and centuries of practical observation, had established them as tools tools for healing the sick, tools for managing the smells of communal life, tools for repelling the insects that threaten stored food and sleeping bodies, tools for the ongoing daily project of keeping a community of people alive and functional in a world where illness moved quickly and the margin between health and catastrophe was narrow. The monk who tended this garden understood his plants with the intimacy of long acquaintance, their growing seasons, their harvesting times, their preparation methods, their specific applications. He was not a scientist in any modern sense. He was something older and in some ways more practical. A person who had learned through direct experience and inherited knowledge what worked. At the center of medieval medical thinking about illness and cleanliness stood a theory that was ancient, widely accepted, and entirely wrong by the standards of modern microbiology, and yet, in its practical consequences, surprisingly effective. The theory of miasma held that disease was carried not by invisible organisms too small to see, but by bad air, the smell of rot, stagnation, decomposition, and waste. This idea, rooted in the medical tradition of ancient Greece and transmitted through the Arabic scholarship that preserved and extended classical learning, was the dominant explanatory framework for epidemic disease throughout the medieval period. When the Black Death arrived in Europe in 1347 and began killing, in some regions, between a third and a half of the population within the space of a few years, the miasma theory was the lens through which physicians, clergy, and ordinary people understood what was happening to them. Bad air rising from the corrupted earth, from stagnant water, from the accumulated waste of cities and the rotting bodies of the dead. This was the enemy, invisible and omnipresent, and the response to it was the management of smell. The practical consequences of this belief were, by a remarkable coincidence of circumstance, often genuinely useful. If disease was carried by bad air, then the logical response was to improve the air, to ventilate enclosed spaces, to remove sources of rot and stagnation, encouraged to introduce aromatic plants whose fragrance would, it was believed, counteract and neutralize the miasmatic corruption. Ventilating enclosed spaces reduced the concentration of airborne pathogens. Removing sources of rot and stagnation reduced the breeding grounds of disease-carrying insects, introducing aromatic plants, many of which had genuine antimicrobial or insect-repelling properties, reduced the biological load of the environment in ways that the miasma theory could not explain, but that the empirical record confirmed. The medieval physician prescribing the burning of aromatic herbs to purify the air of a sick room was operating on a false theory and producing, in some cases, a genuinely beneficial result. The history of medicine is full of such coincidences, and the medieval period is no exception. The environment shaped by the miasma belief was specific and recognizable. In the great halls of castles and manor houses, the floors were strewn with rushes cut from the riverbanks and marshes in summer, spread across the stone or earthen floor in a layer that served as insulation, as a surface for the dogs and the feet of the household, and as a medium for the aromatic herbs mixed into it. Dried lavender and mint, scattered among the rushes, released their fragrance when walked upon, a continuous, low-level perfuming of the air that was understood as both pleasant and protective. The rushes were changed periodically, the old layer swept out and replaced with fresh material, carrying with it the accumulated debris of the hall's daily life. Food scraps, animal waste, the residue of spilled drink and dropped bones, and the new layer spread with fresh herbs mixed in. This was not merely decorative housekeeping. It was a practical response to the biological reality of a space occupied by many people and animals, and the aromatic herbs were a functional component of its management. For those who moved through the streets of medieval cities, where the smell of the world pressed in from every direction, with an intensity that modern experience offers no real preparation for, the pomander was the portable version of the same defense. A small perforated ball of metal or carved wood filled with aromatic spices, cloves, ambergris, musk, dried rose petals, camphor. The pomander was carried in the hand or hung from the belt held to the nose when passing through particularly malodorous sections of the city. It was a luxury object, its contents expensive and its craftsmanship considerable, and it was therefore primarily the possession of the wealthy, the merchant, the physician, the nobleman moving through the market district on business that required proximity to the tanneries and the fishmongers and the open drains. But it expressed, in its most refined and costly form, the same logic that drove the herb bundles in the cottage doorway and the lavender in the rushes of the great hall. The belief that aromatic substances could protect the body from the dangers carried in corrupted air. The monastery infirmary, positioned within the precinct, with the same deliberate care that governed the placement of every monastic building, was a long stone room with narrow windows set high in the walls. Its air was heavy with a specific combination of smells that anyone who entered it would have recognized immediately as the smell of the sick. The beeswax of the candles burning at the bedsides of the seriously ill, the medicinal herbs prepared in the adjacent herb room and administered in various forms to the patients in the beds, the particular stillness of a space devoted to the care of bodies in extremis. The monk infirmarian who moved between the beds carried with him the knowledge of the physic garden, which herbs reduced fever, which eased pain, which promoted sleep, which addressed the specific symptoms of the illnesses he encountered. His pharmacopoeia was limited by modern standards, and his theoretical framework was wrong in its fundamental premises. But within those limitations, he worked with genuine skill and genuine care, and the historical record of monastic medicine documents outcomes that for some conditions were not negligible. Lavender, applied as a wash or inhaled as a steam, was used for headaches and anxiety. Rosemary was prescribed for digestive complaints, and as a general tonic, mint eased nausea. Wormwood, bitter and powerful, was used against intestinal parasites. a genuinely effective application, as wormwood contains compounds with real antiparasitic activity. Tansy served similar purposes. Rue, the most toxic of the common physic garden plants, was used with caution for a range of conditions, its dosage a matter of careful judgment. None of these plants could address the bacterial and viral infections that killed most medieval people who died of illness, but they could ease symptoms, reduce suffering, and in some cases address secondary conditions that, left untreated, would have worsened outcomes. The infirmarian knew this from experience, not from theory, and his knowledge was real. Beyond the monastery walls, in the village and the city, the management of illness and smell fell to a wider range of practitioners and practices. The wise woman of the village, a figure documented in the historical record under various names and with varying degrees of official approval, carried knowledge of local plants and their applications that was empirical, specific, and often effective for the conditions it addressed. She knew which plants grew in the hedgerows and the field margins, when to harvest them, how to prepare them, and what they were good for. Her knowledge was not a systematized, text-based knowledge of the monastic physician. It was something older and in some ways more directly grounded in the specific ecology of her particular place. The plants that grew there, the illnesses that recurred there, the remedies that had worked and the ones that had not. The herbs she gathered served the same dual purpose as those in the physic garden: medicine and management of the domestic environment. Bundles of dried herbs hung in cottage doorways. Lavender and wormwood and elder served as a partial barrier against the insects that carried illness into the household. Herbs tucked into bedding deterred the fleas and lice that were the constant companions of medieval sleep. Aromatic plants burned on the hearth fire released their oils into the air of the cottage, contributing their fragrance to the wood smoke and the smell of cooking and the warm animal breath of the livestock in the corner. The smell of a well-managed medieval cottage was not the smell of squalor. It was the smell of a specific combination of organic materials. Smoke, herbs, wool, tallow, damp earth. That was the olfactory signature of a household, doing its best with what it had. The broader sensory reality of the medieval world, particularly the medieval city, was something that no modern description can fully convey, because the modern sensory baseline is so different from the medieval one that the gap between them is not merely quantitative but qualitative. The smell of a medieval city in summer was not simply stronger than the smell of a modern city. It was different in kind, a layered, complex, biological smell that had no modern equivalent, produced by the simultaneous presence of thousands of human bodies, hundreds of animals, open drains, tanneries, slaughterhouses, fishmongers, bakers, brewers, dyers, and the 1,000 other trades and activities of a functioning urban economy, all operating in close proximity, without the infrastructure of modern sanitation to separate their outputs from the air that everyone breathed. The tanneries on the river's edge where animal hides were processed, in pits of urine and oak bark, the smell of which was powerful enough to be regulated by municipal authorities who required them to operate at a distance from residential areas, contributed their particular note to the urban atmosphere. The fishmongers' stalls, the offal discarded from the butcher's shambles, the open drains carrying the overflow of 1,000 chamber pots toward the river, all of it present, all of it real, all of it simply the texture of the world. And yet the people who lived in this world were not overwhelmed by it, because they had never known anything else. The olfactory adaptation that modern psychology documents, the rapid habituation to persistent smells, the way the brain learns to filter out background odors that are constant and non-threatening, operated in the medieval world as it operates in any world. The smell of the open drain was background. The smell of the tannery was background. The smell of the unwashed body in close quarters was background. What registered as notable, as requiring attention or response, was the smell of something wrong, the specific smell of putrefaction, of illness, of the corruption that the miasma theory associated with danger. Medieval people were not indifferent to smell. They were acutely attentive to it, in ways that their medical theory both reflected and reinforced. They simply had a different baseline from which that attention operated. The medieval understanding of cleanliness, illness, and the management of smell was not a primitive approximation of modern understanding. It was a coherent system, internally consistent, grounded in the best available theory, and supplemented by centuries of practical observation that addressed the real challenges of maintaining health and managing the biological environment of human habitation with the tools and knowledge available. It was wrong in its fundamental mechanism. The miasma theory was wrong, and the germ theory that replaced it was right, but it was not unintelligent, not careless, and not indifferent to the consequences of its failures. Medieval people noticed when their sanitation arrangements produced illness. They adjusted, regulated, and improved those arrangements in response. They developed over centuries a body of practical knowledge about the relationship between cleanliness and health that was empirically grounded, even when theoretically mistaken. As documented in the historical record, medieval people understood far more than modern assumptions give them credit for. They simply tried to make it work with what they already believed. A sick person was observed to produce more of the excretions associated with illness, and those who handled them, or smelled them, also tended to get sick. The connection between proximity to illness and the contraction of illness was observed and acted upon, even without the conceptual framework of contagion theory to explain it. The isolation of the sick in the monastery infirmary, the regulation of waste disposal. In medieval towns, the use of aromatic herbs to purify the air of sick rooms. All of these practices reflected a genuine, if theoretically incomplete, understanding of how illness moved through communities. The evening comes early in November. By the time the last pale light has faded from the western sky over the village fields, the cottage has drawn itself inward around its fire, the door closed against the cold. The world outside reduced to the sound of wind in the thatch, and the occasional movement of the animals in their corner. The fire burns low in the hearth pit, its embers casting a warm, unsteady light across the earthen floor and the rough walls, and the faces of the family settling toward sleep. From the rafters above, the herb bundles hang in the warm air, rising from the fire, lavender, wormwood, a few stems of dried mint, their fragrance thin but present, doing what they have always done, what they were hung there to do. The chamber pot sits in its corner, unremarkable and necessary. The straw pallet holds its shape against the low wooden frame, the linen cover freshly washed and smelling faintly of lye and river water. The rough wool blanket, heavy and warm, is pulled close. Thomas lies still, his large calloused hands folded across his chest, his dark eyes already closing. Eleanor adjusts the position of the youngest child, her movements practiced and economical, her attention already moving toward the morning's first tasks, even as sleep approaches. The cottage smells of wood smoke and the herbs in the rafters, and the warm animal breath of the goats, and the faint, clean sharpness of the washed linen, a specific code layered smell that is the olfactory signature of this particular household, this particular evening, this particular moment in the long, unhurried continuity of medieval life. This world was not clean by modern standards. It could not be. The infrastructure that modern cleanliness requires, running water, mechanical laundry, chemical sanitation, the invisible engineering of pipes and drains and treatment facilities, did not exist, and its absence shaped every aspect of daily life in ways that are genuinely difficult to fully imagine from the other side of the distance that separates us from it. But it was not dirty by indifference or ignorance. It was a world that worked daily and deliberately at the problem of cleanliness, that carried water from the well and made lye from the hearth of the hearth, ash and beat linen against the riverbank stones, and hung herbs from the rafters, and built garderobes over the moat, and employed gong farmers to empty the cesspits and spread rushes on the hall floor, and held pomanders to the nose in the city streets. It was a world that understood, in its own terms and through its own framework, the relationship between cleanliness and health, and that acted on that understanding with the practical intelligence of people for whom the consequences of failure were immediate and personal and could not be delegated to an invisible system. The fire settles in the hearth pit, its embers subsiding from orange to deep red, the last of the evening's warmth radiating outward into the room in slow, diminishing pulses. The smoke rises in thin, unhurried spirals toward the thatch above, finding its way out through the gaps in the roof material with the patience it has always had, the patience of something that has nowhere else to be, and all the time in the world to get there. The herbs hang still in the cooling air. The chamber pot waits in its corner. The washed linen breathes its faint smell of lye and river water into the dark. Outside, the November night has settled over the fields, and the well and the village street with its frozen ruts and its silent drainage channels, over the bathhouse cooling, on the edge of the market town, and the monastery latrine running its quiet water, in the dark and the castle garderobe, and the dark and the castle garderobe, open to the cold air above the moat. The medieval world, in all its complexity and practicality and imperfection, has drawn itself down into sleep, carrying with it the accumulated knowledge of how to survive, how to stay as clean as the available world permits, how to manage the body and the household and the community with the intelligence and the effort and the quiet, unspectacular dignity of people who had no choice but to get it right. The embers pulse once more in the dark, a slow, deep breath of orange light, and then the cottage is still, and the smoke rises, and the medieval night closes over everything, unhurried, absolute and complete.